Hands where I can see them." Officer Patrick Dunmore's voice cracked with adrenaline as he drew his weapon on Major Calvin Steele, who sat perfectly still in his rental car at the Sunoco station. The afternoon sun blazed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the asphalt as curious onlookers began gathering near the convenience store entrance. "You reached for something," Dunmore shouted, his short-sleeved uniform already soaked with sweat despite the routine nature of what should have been a simple traffic stop. Major Steele's hands remained visible on the steering wheel, his green polo shirt and khaki pants marking him as anything but threatening, yet Dunmore's finger twitched on the trigger. What the panicked officer didn't know was that Steele's Delta Force unit was monitoring his GPS location in real time, and 3 Pentagon officials were already dialing emergency numbers as the situation spiraled into a nightmare that would reshape an entire police department. Welcome to Frost Folktales. This is where we tell the stories of those who were underestimated, dismissed, and targeted, yet chose courage over silence. If these stories move you, subscribe and be part of a community that refuses to let them fade into the background. The morning had started like any other for Major Calvin Steele. He'd driven his rental car to the Sunoco station on Millbrook's main strip, needing gas before his flight back to Fort Bragg. The fluorescent lights from the convenience store mixed with the natural sunlight streaming down from the clear October sky, creating the kind of bright, ordinary atmosphere that made what happened next seem impossible. Calvin had been filling his tank when Officer Patrick Dunmore's patrol car pulled into the lot, the engine rumbling with an aggressive idle that immediately caught his attention. Calvin finished pumping gas and climbed back into his car, adjusting his green polo shirt and checking his watch. His khaki pants were perfectly pressed, his posture military straight even in the driver's seat. He was reaching for his seatbelt when he noticed the patrol car had positioned itself directly behind him, blocking his exit. Through his rearview mirror, he could see Officer Dunmore sitting in the cruiser, talking on his radio and staring directly at Calvin with an intensity that made his Delta Force instincts kick in. Something was wrong. Calvin had survived 3 tours in Afghanistan and countless classified missions, and he'd learned to trust his gut when danger approached. But this wasn't a foreign battlefield. This was suburban Pennsylvania on a Tuesday afternoon, with mothers pushing shopping carts and teenagers walking home from school. The overhead fluorescent lights from the gas station canopy cast everything in stark clarity, making the scene feel surreal as Officer Dunmore finally stepped out of his patrol car. Patrick Dunmore had been looking for trouble that day. His short-sleeved uniform hung loosely on his thin frame, and his pale complexion was already flushed with the kind of anger that had gotten him written up twice in the past year. He'd been cruising the main drag when he spotted the rental car with out-of-state plates, and when he saw the black man behind the wheel, something ugly stirred in his chest. He'd called in the license plate, hoping for warrants or violations, but the records came back clean. That only made him angrier. As Dunmore approached the driver's side window, Calvin slowly rolled it down, keeping both hands visible on the steering wheel. The afternoon sun created perfect visibility, with natural skylight streaming down and mixing with the bright fluorescent glow from the station's canopy. There were no shadows, no ambiguity about what was happening. Every movement was clearly visible to the growing crowd of witnesses gathering near the convenience store entrance. Officer Dunmore, his voice already aggressive, barked out his first command: license and registration. Now, his hand rested on his service weapon, a gesture that wasn't lost on Calvin. As a Delta Force major, Calvin had been trained in de-escalation techniques, and he recognized the signs of an officer looking for confrontation rather than conducting routine business. "Of course, officer," Calvin replied calmly, his voice carrying the measured tone of military discipline. "I'm going to reach for my wallet in my back pocket." His movements were deliberate and slow, his hands never leaving Dunmore's line of sight. He produced his driver's license and rental car agreement, extending them toward the officer with steady hands. Dunmore snatched the documents, his eyes scanning them with obvious disappointment. Major Calvin Steele, active duty military, no criminal record, no outstanding warrants. Everything about the stop was clean, which only fueled Dunmore's frustration. He'd pulled over dozens of black men on this same stretch of road, always hoping to find something that would justify his suspicions. The fact that this one was military only made it worse in his twisted worldview. "What are you doing in Millbrook?" Dunmore demanded, his voice rising as more bystanders began to take notice. The gas station was busy that afternoon, with customers coming and going under the bright fluorescent lights. A woman in a red jacket paused near the store entrance, her phone already in her hand as she sensed something was wrong. An elderly man in a blue jacket stopped pushing his shopping cart, his weathered face creasing with concern as he watched the interaction. "Just passing through, sir," Calvin responded, maintaining his military bearing despite the officer's obvious hostility. "I'm returning a rental car before flying back to base." His green polo shirt and khaki pants were professional and clean, nothing about his appearance suggesting any kind of threat. His hands remained on the steering wheel, fingers spread wide and clearly visible. But Patrick Dunmore was beyond reason now. Years of racial resentment and department corruption had created a monster in uniform, and he was determined to escalate the situation, regardless of Calvin's compliance. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Dunmore's imagination began manufacturing threats that didn't exist. In his diseased mind, Calvin's calm demeanor wasn't professionalism, it was defiance that needed to be crushed. "Get out of the car," Dunmore ordered, his hand now gripping his weapon. The fluorescent lights from the gas station created perfect visibility, making it clear to everyone watching that Calvin hadn't made any threatening moves. But Dunmore was operating on prejudice rather than reality, his short-sleeved uniform dark with sweat as his pulse hammered with artificial adrenaline. Calvin complied immediately, stepping out of the car with his hands raised and visible. His movements were controlled and precise, the result of military training that emphasized survival through cooperation. The natural skylight, streaming down from above, illuminated every detail of the scene, creating the kind of clarity that would later prove crucial when investigators reviewed witness statements and security footage. That's when Dunmore's racism reached its boiling point. Seeing Calvin's military bearing, his obvious education and professionalism, only enraged the officer further. In his twisted worldview, black men weren't supposed to carry themselves with dignity and authority. They weren't supposed to be majors in elite military units. They weren't supposed to speak with calm intelligence while being harassed by small-town cops with chips on their shoulders. "Hands where I can see them," Dunmore screamed, drawing his weapon, despite the fact that Calvin's hands were already raised. The witnesses gathered near the convenience store gasped in shock, phones coming out to record as the situation exploded into something unthinkable. The bright afternoon sun made everything crystal clear. There was no ambiguity about Calvin's compliance or Dunmore's aggression. "My hands are visible, sir," Calvin said calmly, his military training keeping him steady even as he stared down the barrel of Dunmore's service weapon. "I'm not reaching for anything. I'm cooperating fully with your instructions." His green polo shirt and khaki pants were clearly civilian clothes, nothing tactical or threatening about his appearance. But Dunmore was lost in his own delusions. "Now, you reached for something," he shouted, his voice cracking with manufactured panic. The lie came so easily, born from years of similar situations where he'd planted evidence or falsified reports to justify his violence. His finger tightened on the trigger as bystanders screamed for him to stop. The shot echoed across the gas station parking lot like thunder, shattering the peaceful afternoon and sending witnesses diving for cover. Calvin's body jerked backward from the impact, his green polo shirt immediately darkening with blood as he collapsed beside his rental car. The fluorescent lights above continued their steady hum, indifferent to the horror playing out beneath them. As Calvin lay bleeding on the asphalt, his vision blurring from shock and pain, he could hear Dunmore already spinning his false narrative into his radio. Shots fired, suspect down, he was reaching for a weapon. The lies flowed smoothly, practiced from years of similar cover-ups. But what Dunmore didn't know was that Calvin's GPS tracker had already sent an automatic distress signal to his Delta Force unit, setting in motion a Pentagon response that would expose decades of corruption and racism within the Millbrook Police Department. The witnesses, who had gathered under the bright afternoon sun, stood in stunned silence, many of them recording the aftermath on their phones. The woman in the red jacket was already giving a statement to other arriving officers, her voice shaking as she described what she'd seen. The elderly man in the blue jacket knelt beside Calvin, applying pressure to his wounds while emergency sirens wailed in the distance. At the Pentagon, 3 different alert systems had already triggered, sending Major Calvin Steele's GPS coordinates and biometric data to his commanding officers. Lieutenant Colonel Edmund Graves was reaching for his phone, his face grim as he processed the implications of a Delta Force major being shot by police. General Vivian Stanton was already mobilizing federal resources, her jaw set with the kind of determination that had made her a legend in military circles. As paramedics worked frantically to stabilize Calvin's vital signs, loading him into an ambulance under the harsh glare of the gas station's fluorescent lights, Officer Patrick Dunmore continued his performance for the arriving backup units. But his lies were already crumbling under the weight of witness testimony and security camera footage that would soon expose the truth about what really happened that bright October afternoon in Millbrook. The GPS tracker in Calvin's phone continued transmitting his location to Pentagon servers, where military intelligence officers were already pulling his classified service record and preparing for a federal response that would shake the foundations of the corrupt police department that had protected officers like Patrick Dunmore for far too long. The Pentagon's Delta Force Operations Center hummed with its usual controlled intensity when the first alert pierced through the afternoon routine. Colonel Edmund Graves was reviewing mission reports at his standing desk when the priority notification flashed across his secure terminal. His weathered face, marked by 2 decades of special operations, immediately hardened as he read the automated message. GPS signal stationary. Distress indicators activated. Major Calvin Steele. Location Millbrook, Pennsylvania. Colonel Edmund Graves felt his stomach drop. In Delta Force, when a GPS tracker went stationary with distress signals, it meant one of 2 things. Their operative was either compromised or down. Neither option was acceptable. Lieutenant Holloway, he barked across the operations floor. Lieutenant Diane Holloway looked up from her monitoring station, her orange tactical shirt crisp under her blue military jacket. At 28, she was one of the Pentagon's most efficient coordination officers, known for her ability to mobilize resources faster than anyone in the building. The urgency in Colonel Edmund Graves's voice sent her into immediate action mode. "Sir, I'm seeing the alert now," she responded, her fingers already flying across multiple keyboards. "Major Calvin Steele's beacon went active 12 minutes ago. Emergency protocols are engaging." Colonel Edmund Graves strode across the operations floor, his boots echoing against the polished concrete. Other personnel turned their attention toward the developing situation, sensing the gravity in the air. When a Delta Force major's emergency beacon activated on American soil, it meant something had gone terribly wrong. "Get me everything," Colonel Edmund Graves ordered. "Police scanner traffic, emergency services, news feeds. I want to know what happened to Major Calvin Steele in the last 15 minutes. Lieutenant Diane Holloway's screens filled with incoming data streams. Her trained eyes scanned police communications, emergency dispatch records, and real-time intelligence feeds. What she found made her blood run cold. "Sir, I'm picking up police radio traffic about an officer-involved shooting at a Sunoco station. The timing and location match Major Calvin Steele's GPS coordinates exactly." The operations center fell silent, except for the constant hum of computers and the soft beeping of monitoring equipment. Officer-involved shooting. Those 3 words carried a weight that every person in that room understood. Major Calvin Steele, a decorated war hero who had served his country with distinction in the most dangerous corners of the world, had apparently been shot by American police. "Patch me through to General Stanton immediately," Colonel Edmund Graves commanded, his voice carrying the controlled fury of a professional soldier. Priority Alpha classification. Within minutes, General Vivian Stanton entered the operations center, her red military dress uniform immaculate despite the speed of her response. At 55, General Vivian Stanton commanded respect throughout the Pentagon, not just for her rank, but for her unwavering commitment to her soldiers. Her dark eyes swept the room, taking in the tense faces and active monitoring stations. "Report," she ordered simply. Colonel Edmund Graves stood at attention. "Ma'am, Major Calvin Steele's emergency beacon activated 23 minutes ago in Millbrook, Pennsylvania. Preliminary intelligence indicates an officer-involved shooting at a gas station. Major Calvin Steele appears to have been the target. General Vivian Stanton's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She had known Major Calvin Steele personally for over 8 years, had pinned medals on his chest, had watched him grow from a promising young officer into one of Delta Force's most reliable operators. "What's his current status?" she asked. Lieutenant Diane Holloway looked up from her communications array. "Ma'am, emergency medical services transported him to Millbrook General Hospital. Condition unknown, but the fact that his GPS is still transmitting suggests he's alive." General Vivian Stanton moved to the central display screen where Lieutenant Diane Holloway had mapped out the incident location and surrounding area. The general studied the data with the analytical mind that had earned her 3 stars and command of special operations. "Pull Major Calvin Steele's service record," she ordered. "I want his complete file displayed." The room's main screen filled with Major Calvin Steele's military profile. Even in the sterile format of official records, his achievements were staggering. 2 Bronze Stars, a Silver Star, multiple commendations for valor, expert marksmanship ratings, and leadership evaluations that consistently rated him in the top 5% of all officers. 12 years of service. Colonel Edmund Graves read aloud. 6 deployments to Afghanistan, 3 to Iraq, 2 classified operations in Syria. Wounded twice in action, both times returned to full duty within months. 0 disciplinary actions, 0 complaints, 0 incidents. General Vivian Stanton studied the record, her expression growing grimmer with each accomplishment. This was a soldier who had risked his life repeatedly for his country, who had led men through impossible missions and brought them home alive. The idea that such a man had been shot by police while simply buying gas was almost incomprehensible. "What was Major Calvin Steele doing in Pennsylvania?" she asked. Lieutenant Diane Holloway consulted her secure databases. "He's on approved leave, ma'am. His wife Rachel Steele lives in Philadelphia. According to travel records, he was driving from Fort Bragg to visit her." The personal detail hit General Vivian Stanton harder than she expected. She remembered Rachel Steele from military social functions, a kind woman who supported her husband's dangerous career with grace and strength. Now she was probably in a hospital somewhere, wondering if her husband would survive a routine stop for gasoline. "Why does Major Calvin Steele have constant GPS monitoring?" General Vivian Stanton asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Colonel Edmund Graves accessed classified files. "Ma'am, Major Calvin Steele was part of Operation Silent Thunder 6 months ago. Due to the sensitive nature of that mission and potential threats from hostile foreign actors, all team members maintain GPS tracking for security purposes. The system automatically activates distress protocols if the signal becomes stationary for more than 10 minutes in an emergency situation." Operation Silent Thunder. General Vivian Stanton knew that designation well. It had been a joint CIA Delta Force operation to eliminate a terrorist cell that had been planning attacks on American military installations. Major Calvin Steele had led the assault team that successfully neutralized the threat, saving potentially hundreds of American lives. The mission had been classified at the highest levels, but it had also put him on the radar of several international terrorist organizations seeking revenge. "So our GPS monitoring, designed to protect him from foreign enemies, just alerted us that he's been shot by American police," General Vivian Stanton said, the irony bitter in her voice. "Yes, ma'am." Colonel Edmund Graves confirmed. General Vivian Stanton turned to address the entire operations center. "I'm authorizing a full Pentagon investigation into this incident. I want a team on the ground in Millbrook within 2 hours. Lieutenant Holloway, coordinate with the Justice Department and FBI. This is now a federal matter." Lieutenant Diane Holloway nodded, already pulling up contact lists for federal agencies. "Ma'am, should I notify the Secretary of Defense?" "I'll handle that personally," General Vivian Stanton replied. "Right now, I want to know everything about what happened at that gas station. Get me witness statements, security footage, police reports, everything." As the team mobilized around her, General Vivian Stanton felt the familiar surge of protective anger that came when one of her soldiers was threatened. Major Calvin Steele had survived Taliban ambushes, IED explosions, and firefights in some of the world's most dangerous places. The thought that he might die on American soil shot by the very people he had sworn to protect, was unacceptable. Meanwhile, back in Millbrook, paramedics worked frantically over Major Calvin Steele's unconscious form in the back of the ambulance racing toward the hospital. His vital signs were weak but stable, blood pressure dropping as internal bleeding continued despite their best efforts to control it. At the gas station, Officer Patrick Dunmore continued weaving his false narrative for the backup officers who had arrived on scene. His short-sleeved uniform was still stained with Major Calvin Steele's blood, but his voice remained steady as he repeated his fabricated version of events. The suspect was acting erratically. Officer Patrick Dunmore told Sergeant Troy Mulligan, who had responded to the shooting call, "I observed him reaching toward the glove compartment in what appeared to be an attempt to retrieve a weapon. I gave multiple verbal commands which he ignored. I was forced to use deadly force to protect myself and the civilians in the area." Sergeant Troy Mulligan nodded, writing down the statement without questioning its accuracy. This was how things worked in the Millbrook Police Department. Officers backed up other officers, regardless of circumstances. The truth was, whatever they said it was, but this time would be different. This time the Pentagon was watching. Back at the Pentagon, Lieutenant Diane Holloway received the first detailed reports from their intelligence network. "Sir, I'm getting conflicting information from the scene. The officer claims Major Calvin Steele was reaching for a weapon, but preliminary witness statements suggest he never moved his hands from the steering wheel." General Vivian Stanton's expression darkened further. "What about security footage?" "Still trying to access that, ma'am. The gas station has cameras, but local police have secured the scene. We may need federal authority to obtain the recordings." "You'll have it," General Vivian Stanton promised. "Colonel Graves, I want you personally on the ground in Millbrook. Take whatever team you need. I want this investigation to be thorough, professional, and absolutely by the book." Colonel Edmund Graves saluted sharply. "Understood, ma'am." "What are the rules of engagement with local law enforcement?" General Vivian Stanton's smile was cold and determined. "Full cooperation is expected. Federal jurisdiction supersedes local authority in this matter. Make that very clear to anyone who might be confused about who's in charge now." As Colonel Edmund Graves prepared to deploy to Pennsylvania, General Vivian Stanton stood looking at Major Calvin Steele's service record, still displayed on the main screen. 12 years of exemplary service, countless lives saved, missions completed that would never be publicly acknowledged. If he died because of this shooting, it would be a tragedy. But if he died because of lies and corruption, it would be something far worse. The Pentagon's response was now in motion, unstoppable and precise as only military operations could be. Officer Patrick Dunmore had shot the wrong soldier on the wrong day. Now he was about to discover what happened when you declared war on the United States military. The battle for justice had begun. The fluorescent lights of Millbrook General Hospital's trauma bay cast harsh shadows across the linoleum floor as Dr. Irene Ashford burst through the emergency room doors. Her red scrubs were already stained with coffee from the rushed morning, but now they would carry much more significant marks. The overhead announcement crackled through the sterile air. "Trauma team to Bay 3, GSW to the chest, ETA 2 minutes. Dr. Ashford's hands moved with practiced precision as she pulled on surgical gloves, her mind already racing through protocols. 23 years of emergency medicine had prepared her for moments like these, but something about the dispatch call nagged at her. A police shooting at the Sunoco station, another black man down. The cycle seemed endless in Millbrook, but today felt different somehow. The ambulance doors crashed open as paramedics wheeled in. Major Calvin Steele, even unconscious and bleeding, his bearing remained somehow dignified. Dr. Ashford's trained eye immediately assessed the damage as they transferred him to the trauma table. The bullet had entered his chest at close range, and blood loss was severe. "Talk to me," Dr. Ashford commanded, pulling her stethoscope around her neck. Calvin Steele, 34 years old, single GSW to the right chest, lost consciousness at the scene, BP dropping fast. "We've got 2 large-bore IVs running, but he's lost a lot of blood," the lead paramedic reported breathlessly. Dr. Ashford leaned over Major Calvin Steele noting his strong jawline and the small scar above his left eyebrow that spoke of previous battles survived. His green polo shirt had been cut away by the paramedics, revealing the devastating wound. The bullet's entry point suggested internal organ damage, possibly to the liver or lung. "Get me 4 units of O-negative and Prep-or-2 immediately," she ordered the nursing team. "This man's going to need surgery now." As the trauma team worked with mechanical efficiency, Dr. Ashford couldn't shake the feeling that this patient was different. There was something about his bearing, even unconscious, that suggested discipline and strength. She'd seen plenty of shooting victims over the years, but this man had the build and bearing of someone accustomed to facing danger. 20 minutes into the initial stabilization, the emergency room doors burst open again. Rachel Steele rushed in, wearing a flowing red dress that now seemed tragically inappropriate for the circumstances. Her face was streaked with tears, and her usually perfect makeup had run in dark lines down her cheeks. "Where is he? Where's my husband?" Rachel's voice cracked with desperation as she approached the nurse's station. The desk nurse looked up sympathetically. "Ma'am, if you could just—" "Calvin Steele. They said he was shot. Please, I need to see him." Rachel's hands trembled as she gripped the counter, her wedding ring catching the fluorescent light. Dr. Ashford emerged from the trauma bay, pulling off her bloodied gloves. The sight of Rachel Steele's anguished face reminded her why she'd chosen medicine in the first place. Behind the clinical procedures and medical terminology was always a family, always someone whose world was crumbling. "Mrs. Steele, I'm Dr. Irene Ashford, and I'm taking care of your husband." She placed a gentle hand on Rachel's shoulder, feeling the woman's entire body shaking. Is he going to—" Rachel couldn't finish the question, the possibility too terrible to voice. "He's alive, but he's seriously injured. The bullet caused significant internal damage, and we need to get him into surgery immediately." "I'm going to be honest with you, Mrs. Steele. The next few hours are critical." Rachel's legs nearly buckled, and a nurse quickly brought her a chair. "Can I see him? Please, just for a moment?" Dr. Ashford nodded and escorted Rachel into the trauma bay. The sight of Calvin connected to multiple machines, his chest rising and falling with mechanical assistance, sent Rachel into a fresh wave of tears. She reached for his hand, careful not to disturb the IV lines. "He was just getting gas," Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible above the beeping monitors. "He called me from the car, said he'd be home in 20 minutes. We were supposed to have dinner together. How does getting gas turn into this?" Before Dr. Ashford could respond, the emergency room doors opened with military precision. Lieutenant Diane Holloway strode in wearing an orange tactical shirt under her blue jacket, her posture radiating authority and barely contained anger. Behind her, Colonel Edmund Graves moved with the measured pace of a man accustomed to command, his steel-gray eyes taking in every detail of the scene. "I'm Lieutenant Holloway, U.S. Army," she announced to the nurse's station, producing official identification. "We're here regarding Major Calvin Steele." Dr. Ashford emerged from the trauma bay, immediately recognizing the military bearing of the new arrivals. "Are you family?" "We're his unit," Colonel Graves replied, his voice carrying decades of military authority. "Major Steele is one of our finest officers." "What's his condition?" "Critical. The bullet caused severe internal bleeding and potential organ damage. We're preparing for emergency surgery." Dr. Ashford appreciated their controlled demeanor, so different from the chaos that usually surrounded shooting victims. Lieutenant Holloway's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Doctor, what we're about to tell you is classified, but Major Steele is a decorated Delta Force operative returning from a classified mission. This shooting isn't just a local police matter anymore." The weight of that information settled over Dr. Ashford like a heavy blanket. She'd been treating a war hero, someone who'd survived combat zones, only to be shot at a gas station in his own country. The emergency room doors swung open once more, admitting Chief Walter Simmons. His orange shirt was already damp with perspiration beneath his blue police jacket, and his face carried the look of a man trying to control a situation rapidly spinning beyond his grasp. "I need to speak with the medical team," Chief Simmons announced, his voice attempting authority but carrying an undertone of desperation. Colonel Graves stepped forward. positioning himself between the police chief and Dr. Ashford. "Chief Simmons, I presume? I'm Colonel Edmund Graves, and this investigation is now under federal jurisdiction." Chief Simmons's face reddened. "Now wait just a minute. This is my jurisdiction." And Officer Dunmore was acting in self-defense. The suspect reached for Major Steele. Lieutenant Holloway interrupted coldly. "Is a decorated officer who has never committed a crime in his life. And he's not a suspect, Chief. He's a victim." The tension in the emergency room became palpable. Dr. Ashford watched the confrontation unfold, noting how the military officer's controlled fury contrasted sharply with Chief Simmons's defensive bluster. "We have dashboard camera footage," Colonel Graves continued, producing a tablet device. "Would you like to explain how Major Steele supposedly reached for a weapon when his hands never left the steering wheel?" Chief Simmons's face paled as he watched the footage. The video clearly showed Major Calvin Steele sitting calmly with his hands visible, followed by Officer Patrick Dunmore's aggressive approach and unjustified shooting. "There must be some mistake," Chief Simmons stammered. "Officer Dunmore is a veteran officer who apparently has a history of questionable shootings," Lieutenant Holloway interjected, consulting her own tablet. "We've been busy since we received the alert, Chief." "Very busy." Dr. Ashford cleared her throat, reminding everyone present why they were there. "I need to get Major Steele into surgery immediately. His condition is deteriorating." Rachel Steele, who had been watching the exchange through her tears, suddenly stood up. "You're saying this was intentional? That officer shot my husband for no reason?" The pain in her voice cut through the tension like a knife. Colonel Graves's expression softened as he turned to her. "Mrs. Steele, your husband is a hero who has served his country with distinction. What happened today was a grave injustice, but I promise you there will be accountability." Dr. Ashford made the decision to intervene. "Everyone needs to step back. My patient requires immediate surgery, and this discussion can continue in the waiting area." As the team prepared to move Major Calvin Steele to the operating room, Dr. Ashford took a moment to explain the procedure to Rachel. "The bullet appears to have damaged his liver and possibly nicked his lung. The surgery will take several hours, and I'll update you as soon as possible." Rachel nodded through her tears, squeezing Calvin's hand one more time before they wheeled him away. "Fight, baby, please fight." In the surgical waiting area, the confrontation continued. Lieutenant Holloway pulled up additional files on her tablet, showing them to Colonel Graves, while Chief Simmons paced nervously nearby. 3 previous shootings involving minorities, all ruled justified, she reported quietly. "But look at the witness statements that were buried and the evidence that disappeared." Colonel Graves studied the information with the methodical approach of a career military officer. "Chief Simmons, it appears your department has some serious explaining to do." "I run a clean department," Chief Simmons protested weakly. "If there were problems, I would have known about them. Would you?" Lieutenant Holloway's voice carried the sharp edge of someone who'd spent years investigating corruption. "Or would you have been too busy looking the other way?" Rachel Steele sat in the corner, still in her red dress, looking small and vulnerable despite her earlier strength. The reality of her situation was settling in, the possibility that she might lose her husband to senseless violence. Colonel Graves approached her with the careful respect due to a military family member. "Mrs. Steele, I want you to know that Major Steele's service has been exemplary. He's saved countless lives and served with distinction in the most dangerous places on earth." "He's the gentlest man I know," Rachel whispered. "He rescues stray cats and helps elderly neighbors with their groceries. How could anyone see him as a threat?" The question hung in the air like an indictment, unanswered and painful. Outside the hospital windows, news vans were beginning to gather as word of the shooting spread. This was about to become much bigger than Chief Simmons had anticipated. Dr. Ashford emerged from the operating room 3 hours later, her red scrubs now bearing the marks of intensive surgery. The waiting area fell silent as she approached the group. "The surgery went as well as could be expected," she began, choosing her words carefully. "We've repaired the liver damage and reinflated his lung. Major Steele is stable, but he remains in critical condition. The next 24 hours will be crucial. Rachel Steele broke down completely, the relief and continued fear overwhelming her simultaneously. Lieutenant Holloway sat beside her, offering the strong support that came naturally to a military officer. "Can I see him?" Rachel asked weakly. "He's in recovery now, sedated, and on a ventilator. But yes, you can see him shortly." As Dr. Ashford walked away, she reflected on the day's events. In her years of treating trauma victims, she'd seen the worst of humanity. But today, she'd also witnessed something else: the power of truth and the determination of people who refuse to let injustice stand unchallenged. The fight for Major Calvin Steele's life was far from over, but the fight for justice was just beginning. The morning sun cast sharp shadows across the Millbrook Police Department parking lot as 3 black SUVs pulled up in perfect formation. General Vivian Stanton stepped out of the lead vehicle, her red military dress uniform commanding immediate attention from every officer who happened to be watching. The gold stars on her shoulders caught the overhead fluorescent lighting streaming from the station's windows, and her presence alone shifted the entire atmosphere of the small-town police department. Attorney Gerald Okafor emerged from the second SUV, adjusting his green suit jacket and straightening his blue tie as he surveyed the building before them. His briefcase contained federal warrants and legal documents that would change everything for the Millbrook Police Department. Behind him, Captain Ruben Castillo from Internal Affairs stepped onto the asphalt, his orange shirt visible beneath his blue jacket, his muscular frame and no-nonsense expression making it clear that this wasn't a friendly visit. General Stanton's team moved with military precision as they approached the station entrance. The automatic doors slid open, and the bustling noise of the police department gradually fell silent as officers noticed the federal presence entering their domain. Chief Walter Simmons, wearing his standard orange shirt under his blue police jacket, emerged from his office with a forced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "General Stanton, I presume," Chief Simmons said, extending his hand in what he hoped appeared to be a welcoming gesture. "I wish we were meeting under better circumstances." General Stanton's handshake was firm and brief. "Chief Simmons, I'm here on behalf of the United States Army and the Pentagon to investigate the shooting of Major Calvin Steele. This is Attorney Gerald Okafor, our legal counsel, and Captain Ruben Castillo from Internal Affairs." Her voice carried the authority of decades of military service and left no room for misinterpretation about who was now in charge. Chief Simmons shifted uncomfortably.
"Of course, we're fully prepared to cooperate. Officer Dunmore has already filed his report, and we're conducting our own internal investigation."
"Your internal investigation is now secondary to our federal inquiry," Attorney Okafor stated, opening his briefcase and producing a stack of official documents. "We're assuming jurisdiction over this case under federal civil rights statutes. Major Steele is not just any citizen. He's a decorated Delta Force operative, and his shooting while unarmed constitutes a potential federal crime." Captain Castillo stepped forward, his expression stern. "We need to interview every witness immediately. I want a complete list of all officers who responded to the scene, all dispatch recordings, and every piece of evidence your department has collected." As the federal team established their command presence, Detective Carmen Vega appeared from the bullpen area. Her red blouse stood out among the sea of standard police uniforms, and her demeanor was noticeably different from her fellow officers. While others seemed nervous and defensive about the federal investigation, Detective Vega approached with what appeared to be relief. "Detective Vega," she introduced herself to General Stanton, extending her hand. "I was one of the first officers to arrive at the scene after the shooting." General Stanton studied the detective's face, noting something in her expression that seemed different from the others. "Detective, I'd like to speak with you privately. Your cooperation in this investigation will be noted and appreciated." Meanwhile, Captain Castillo had begun his systematic approach to evidence gathering. The Sunoco gas station had been reopened, but he'd ordered it temporarily closed again for a more thorough federal examination. Forensics experts wearing FBI windbreakers were already processing the scene with equipment far more sophisticated than anything the local police department possessed. The first breakthrough came within hours. The gas station's security system had captured everything from multiple angles, and the footage told a story completely different from Officer Patrick Dunmore's official report. Captain Castillo reviewed the high-definition video on his tablet, his jaw tightening as he watched Major Calvin Steele's hands remain visible on the steering wheel throughout the entire encounter. "General, you need to see this," Captain Castillo called out, his voice carrying a mixture of anger and vindication. General Stanton leaned over his shoulder as the video played. They could see Major Calvin Steele's green polo shirt clearly as he sat calmly in his rental car. His hands never moved from the steering wheel, not even when Officer Patrick Dunmore began shouting commands. The timestamp showed the exact sequence of events, and at no point did Major Calvin Steele make any movement that could be construed as reaching for a weapon. This completely contradicts Officer Dunmore's statement, Attorney Okafor observed, making notes on his legal pad. He claimed Major Steele reached toward the glove compartment. This video clearly shows that never happened, but the most damaging evidence was yet to come. When the FBI's audio enhancement specialists processed Officer Patrick Dunmore's dashboard camera recording, they uncovered audio that had been conveniently omitted from the official police report. Through advanced filtering techniques, they isolated Officer Dunmore's voice, clearly using racial slurs as he approached Major Calvin Steele's vehicle. Detective Carmen Vega was present when the enhanced audio was played back, and her reaction was immediate and visceral. "I knew something wasn't right about his story," she said, her voice filled with disgust. "Patrick has always had problems with authority when it came to black citizens, but the department never wanted to address it." General Stanton's expression hardened as she processed this information. "Detective Vega, are you saying this officer has a history of racial bias that the department was aware of?" "More than bias, General," Detective Vega replied, glancing around nervously before continuing. "There have been complaints before. 3 other incidents involving black men that were all ruled justified by internal affairs. But the circumstances were always questionable, and witnesses sometimes changed their stories after talking to department brass." Captain Castillo immediately began documenting Detective Vega's statements, while simultaneously requesting all personnel files related to Officer Patrick Dunmore. The pattern she described was exactly what federal investigators looked for in civil rights violation cases, a history of racially motivated violence covered up by corrupt departmental leadership. As the investigation expanded, more witnesses began coming forward. The FBI had set up a temporary command center in a conference room at the Millbrook Community Center, and citizens who had been afraid to speak to local police felt safer talking to federal agents. Maria Santos, the store clerk who had witnessed the shooting, provided testimony that directly contradicted Officer Dunmore's version of events. "The soldier never moved," Maria told Captain Castillo, her voice shaking as she recalled the traumatic scene. "His hands stayed on the wheel the whole time. Officer Dunmore just started yelling and then shot him. There was no reason for it, none at all." 2 other witnesses, James Mitchell and Sarah Williams, provided similar accounts. All 3 civilians described Major Calvin Steele as calm and cooperative, with his hands clearly visible throughout the encounter. Their testimonies painted a picture of an unjustified shooting by an officer who seemed to escalate the situation deliberately. By mid-afternoon, General Stanton had gathered enough evidence to fundamentally alter the entire trajectory of the case. She called Chief Walter Simmons into the conference room that had been temporarily converted into a federal command center. The chief entered looking increasingly uncomfortable as he took in the organized efficiency of the federal investigation. "Chief Simmons," General Stanton began, her tone carrying the full weight of federal authority. "The evidence we've uncovered in just one day contradicts everything in Officer Dunmore's report. We have video proof that Major Steele never moved his hands, audio evidence of racial slurs, and multiple witness testimonies that support a completely different narrative than what your officer provided." Chief Simmons loosened his collar, sweat beginning to form on his forehead despite the air conditioning. "General, I'm sure there's an explanation. Officer Dunmore is an experienced officer with years of service during which he's been involved in 3 previous shootings of black men." Attorney Okafor interjected, reading from a file that Captain Castillo had compiled, "all of which were ruled justified by your department's Internal Affairs Division. That pattern alone warrants federal scrutiny." General Stanton leaned forward, her red uniform and authoritative presence dominating the room. "Chief, Let me be absolutely clear about our position. The Pentagon is assuming full jurisdiction over this investigation. Major Calvin Steele is a decorated soldier who has served his country with distinction in classified operations around the world. He was shot while unarmed and compliant during what should have been a routine traffic stop. This is now a federal case. The chief's face grew pale as the implications became clear. What exactly does that mean for our department? It means your officer will face federal charges for civil rights violations and attempted murder, Attorney Okafor stated matter-of-factly. It means your department's handling of this case and previous similar incidents will be subject to federal review. And it means that if we find evidence of systematic civil rights violations or a pattern of covering up police misconduct, your entire department could face federal oversight. Detective Carmen Vega, who had been observing the confrontation from across the room, felt a surge of satisfaction watching federal authority assert itself over the corrupt leadership she'd watched protect bad officers for years. Her decision to cooperate with the federal investigation had been easy. She joined the police force to serve justice, not to participate in its obstruction. Captain Castillo approached General Stanton with additional findings. General, our forensics team has confirmed that Major Steele's fingerprints are not on his glove compartment, center console, or anywhere else Officer Dunmore claimed he was reaching. The physical evidence completely supports the video footage and witness testimony. As the day progressed, the weight of evidence against Officer Patrick Dunmore became overwhelming. The federal investigation had accomplished in 8 hours what the local police department had apparently failed to do in days. Establish the truth about what happened at that Sunoco station. General Stanton concluded the day by holding a brief meeting with her team. We have more than enough evidence to proceed with federal charges. Major Steele was the victim of an unprovoked, racially motivated shooting by a police officer with a documented history of similar behavior. Tomorrow, we'll be expanding our investigation into the departmental culture that allowed this pattern to continue unchecked. The Pentagon had spoken, and justice for Major Calvin Steele was no longer in the hands of the local police department that had failed him so completely. The fluorescent lights in the Millbrook Police Department's records room cast harsh shadows across Captain Ruben Castillo's determined face as he methodically worked through boxes of sealed complaint files. His orange tactical shirt and blue federal jacket marked him as an outsider in this corrupt system, but his muscular frame and unwavering focus made it clear he belonged exactly where he was. The Pentagon had given him full authority to investigate, and what he was uncovering made his blood run cold. Lieutenant Holloway, you need to see this, Captain Ruben Castillo called out, his voice tight with controlled anger. He held up a manila folder, marked confidential, sealed by order of Chief Simmons from 2019. Lieutenant Diane Holloway looked up from her laptop, where she'd been working with Pentagon cyber specialists to recover deleted data. Her orange shirt and blue jacket bore the same federal authority as Captain Ruben Castillo's uniform, and her expression hardened as she approached the evidence table. "What did you find?" she asked, though the grim set of Captain Ruben Castillo's jaw already told her it was bad. Marcus Williams, age 23, shot by Officer Patrick Dunmore during a traffic stop in August 2. Multiple witnesses claimed Williams had his hands visible on the steering wheel. Officer Dunmore reported that Williams reached for what appeared to be a weapon. Captain Ruben Castillo's voice carried the weight of terrible familiarity. "Sound familiar?" Lieutenant Diane Holloway felt her stomach drop. The parallels to Major Calvin Steele's shooting were unmistakable. "Please tell me there's more." Captain Ruben Castillo opened another file. David Thompson, age 28, shot by Officer Patrick Dunmore in January 2020. Same story, same lies. And here's Jerome Washington, age 31, shot just 6 months ago. His hands shook slightly as he spread the photographs and witness statements across the table. 3 other black men, Lieutenant Holloway. 3 other families destroyed by this monster's hatred. The weight of systematic violence and corruption settled over them like a suffocating blanket. Lieutenant Diane Holloway picked up the witness statements, reading testimonies that had been buried, voices that had been silenced. These witnesses all said the victims never reached for anything. Their statements were suppressed. "Gets worse," Captain Ruben Castillo said, pulling out financial records. Chief Walter Simmons received payments totaling over $200,000 from what appears to be a legal defense fund. money that flowed through shell companies to keep Officer Patrick Dunmore on the streets and these cases buried. Lieutenant Diane Holloway's laptop chimed with an incoming message from the Pentagon cyber team. Her face went pale as she read the screen. Captain Ruben Castillo, they recovered the deleted body camera footage from Officer Dunmore's previous incidents. All 3 shootings were captured, and in every case, the footage was deliberately deleted within hours of the incidents. The systematic nature of the corruption was breathtaking in its scope and horrifying in its implications. This wasn't just one bad cop making split-second decisions. This was a calculated pattern of racial violence protected by institutional cover-ups at the highest levels. Meanwhile, at Millbrook General Hospital, the sterile brightness of the surgical suite provided stark contrast to the dark revelations unfolding at the police station. Dr. Irene Ashford's red surgical scrubs were splattered with evidence of her 12-hour battle to save Major Calvin Steele's life. His condition had deteriorated overnight, requiring emergency surgery to address internal bleeding that threatened to end everything the federal investigation was fighting for. His vitals are stabilizing, Dr. Irene Ashford announced to the surgical team, her skilled hands working with precision that matched any military operation. The bullet fragments caused more damage than we initially realized, but Major Calvin Steele is a fighter. His military conditioning is keeping him alive. In the hospital corridor, Rachel Steele sat in a red dress that had become wrinkled from hours of waiting and worrying. Colonel Edmund Graves stood nearby, his blue jacket and orange shirt marking his federal authority even in this medical setting. His muscular frame remained alert despite the emotional exhaustion that showed in his eyes. "Any word from Captain Ruben Castillo's investigation?" Rachel Steele asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Colonel Edmund Graves checked his secure phone. "They're uncovering things that go back years, Rachel. Officer Patrick Dunmore has done this before, multiple times. Your husband wasn't his first victim." The revelation hit Rachel Steele like a physical blow. The thought that other families had endured this same nightmare, that other wives had sat in similar hospital corridors wondering if their husbands would survive, filled her with a grief that extended far beyond her own pain. Back at the police station, General Vivian Stanton arrived wearing her red military dress uniform, her presence commanding immediate attention from every person in the building. Her authority was absolute, her purpose clear. Behind her walked Attorney Gerald Okafor in his green suit and blue tie, carrying briefcases full of federal warrants and legal documents that would dismantle decades of corruption. Captain Ruben Castillo, Lieutenant Diane Holloway, report. General Vivian Stanton commanded as she entered the records room. "General, we've documented a pattern of racial violence spanning over 5 years. Captain Ruben Castillo replied, his voice professional despite the anger burning in his eyes. Officer Patrick Dunmore has shot 4 black men in nearly identical circumstances. 3 previous victims survived but were intimidated into silence. Chief Walter Simmons orchestrated cover-ups in each case, accepting financial compensation for his protection." Lieutenant Diane Holloway added, "Our cyber team recovered deleted body camera footage from all previous incidents. In every case, the victims had their hands visible and posed no threat. Officer Dunmore's reports were fabricated, and Chief Simmons approved the evidence destruction." General Vivian Stanton studied the evidence spread across the table, her expression growing harder with each revelation. The scope of corruption wasn't just about one shooting or one corrupt officer. This was systematic racism protected by institutional power, a conspiracy that had destroyed lives and shattered community trust for years. "Where is Chief Walter Simmons now?" General Vivian Stanton asked. "Barricaded in his office with his attorney." Attorney Gerald Okafor replied. "He's refusing to cooperate and demanding immunity in exchange for his testimony." "Immunity?" General Vivian Stanton's voice carried the full weight of federal authority and personal outrage. "This man has presided over years of racial violence and systematic corruption. He'll receive justice, not immunity." The general walked to the window overlooking the police station parking lot where news crews had gathered and community members held vigil for Major Calvin Steele. The bright daylight streaming through the windows illuminated the evidence of corruption spread across the tables, creating a stark visual representation of truth emerging from darkness. "Lieutenant Diane Holloway, I want every piece of evidence documented and preserved. These previous victims and their families deserve justice, delayed but not denied. General Vivian Stanton's command carried both legal authority and moral imperative. Yes, General. We're also uncovering evidence of witness intimidation and evidence tampering in other cases not involving Officer Dunmore. This corruption runs through multiple levels of the department. At the hospital, Dr. Irene Ashford emerged from surgery, pulling off her surgical cap as she approached Rachel Steele and Colonel Edmund Graves. Her red scrubs were now clean, but exhaustion lined her face after hours of fighting to save Major Calvin Steele's life. The surgery was successful, Dr. Irene Ashford announced, bringing immediate relief to Rachel Steele's tear-filled eyes. Major Calvin Steele's condition has stabilized. His military fitness and mental strength are significant factors in his recovery. He's not out of danger, but his prognosis has improved significantly. Rachel Steele collapsed into Colonel Edmund Graves's arms. Months of fear and anxiety finally finding release in tears of relief and hope. Her husband was fighting and winning his battle for life, just as the federal investigation was fighting and winning the battle for justice. "Can I see him?" Rachel Steele asked. "In a few hours, once we have him settled in intensive care. He's unconscious but responsive to stimuli. Keep talking to him when you visit. Familiar voices can aid recovery." Back at the police station, the confrontation everyone had been anticipating finally arrived. Chief Walter Simmons emerged from his office, no longer wearing his uniform, but dressed in civilian clothes, as if trying to distance himself from the badge he'd dishonored. His orange shirt and blue jacket couldn't hide the defeat written across his face. "General Stanton, I want to make a deal," Chief Walter Simmons said, his voice lacking any of the authority he'd once commanded. "The only deal you'll receive is the constitutional right to an attorney," General Vivian Stanton replied. "You've presided over a department that systematically violated the civil rights of citizens under your protection. You've taken money to cover up racial violence. You've destroyed evidence and intimidated witnesses. Your badge represented trust, and you sold that trust for personal profit." Attorney Gerald Okafor stepped forward with federal arrest warrants. "Walter Simmons, you are under arrest for conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of law, obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, and accepting bribes in connection with official duties." As federal agents placed Chief Walter Simmons in handcuffs, General Vivian Stanton addressed the assembled officers who had gathered to witness their chief's arrest. Many looked shocked, but others showed relief that the corruption protecting officers like Patrick Dunmore was finally being exposed. Effective immediately, the United States Department of Defense, in coordination with the Department of Justice, is assuming operational oversight of the Millbrook Police Department, General Vivian Stanton announced. This department will be rebuilt from the ground up, with transparency, accountability, and respect for constitutional rights as its foundation. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed brighter as General Vivian Stanton continued. "Every case involving Officer Patrick Dunmore will be reviewed. Every complaint that was suppressed will be investigated. Every family that was silenced will have their voices heard. This ends now." As Chief Walter Simmons was led away in federal custody, Lieutenant Diane Holloway received a call from the hospital. Major Calvin Steele was showing signs of improvement, his vital signs strengthening, his body beginning to heal from the trauma inflicted by hatred and protected by corruption. The investigation had revealed a pattern of systematic racism that destroyed lives and corrupted justice. But it had also revealed something else: the power of truth to overcome institutional lies, the strength of federal authority to challenge local corruption, and the resilience of one man whose service to his country would ultimately serve his community by exposing the darkness that had hidden in plain sight for far too long. Justice was finally mobilizing, and Major Calvin Steele was fighting his way back to witness it. The morning sun cast long shadows across Officer Patrick Dunmore's suburban driveway as 3 black SUVs rolled silently into position. Federal agents wearing orange tactical shirts under blue bulletproof vests emerged with practiced precision, their movements coordinated through years of high-stakes operations. Agent Marcus Thompson adjusted his earpiece and signaled his team as they approached the modest 2-story house where Patrick Dunmore lived. completely unaware that his world was about to collapse. Inside the house, Patrick Dunmore sat at his kitchen table, in boxer shorts and a wrinkled white t-shirt, scrolling through his phone with the casual arrogance of a man who believed himself untouchable. He'd spent the past week fielding congratulatory calls from fellow officers, each one reinforcing his delusion that shooting Major Calvin Steele would be swept under the rug like every other incident before. The department's protection had always been absolute. Chief Walter Simmons had always made the problems disappear. The thunderous knock on his front door shattered that illusion instantly. Patrick Dunmore, this is the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Open the door immediately. Patrick's phone clattered to the floor as he jumped up, his face draining of color. Through the window blinds, he could see agents positioned around his property, their weapons drawn and ready. This wasn't supposed to happen. The department was supposed to protect him. Chief Simmons had promised everything would be handled internally. There must be some mistake, he called out, his voice cracking with panic. I'm a police officer. I was doing my job. Agent Thompson's voice carried the weight of federal authority. Mr. Dunmore, you have 30 seconds to open this door before we breach it. You are under arrest on federal charges. With trembling hands, Patrick unlocked the door and found himself face to face with 6 federal agents, their expressions stone-cold professional. Agent Thompson stepped forward, his muscular frame filling the doorway as he held up his credentials. Patrick Dunmore, you are under arrest for the attempted murder of Major Calvin Steele, violation of civil rights under color of law, filing false police reports, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. The handcuffs clicked into place with finality that made Patrick's knees buckle. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. This is impossible, Patrick stammered, as agents secured his arms behind his back. You don't understand. He was reaching for something. I had to defend myself. The department will verify everything. Agent Thompson's smile held no warmth. Mr. Dunmore, your department is currently under federal investigation. Your chief is facing his own set of charges. The protection you've relied on no longer exists. The reality hit Patrick like a physical blow. As federal agents led him toward their vehicle, neighbors emerged from their houses, some recording on their phones, others simply watching in stunned silence. The man who had terrorized Millbrook's black community for years was finally being held accountable, and the sight filled many with a satisfaction they hadn't dared hope for. Across town at the federal courthouse, Attorney Gerald Okafor stood behind a podium bristling with microphones, his green suit and blue tie perfectly pressed despite the early morning hour. Cameras from news outlets across the state captured every word as he detailed the charges against Patrick Dunmore, his voice carrying the authority of federal justice. The evidence against Officer Patrick Dunmore is overwhelming and damning, Attorney Okafor announced, his measured tone making each word hit with maximum impact. Video evidence, witness testimony, and forensic analysis all confirm that Major Calvin Steele posed no threat whatsoever. His hands never left the steering wheel. He never reached for any object. Officer Dunmore's actions were not only unjustified, but appear to be racially motivated based on audio evidence recovered from his patrol car. The crowd of reporters erupted with questions, but Attorney Okafor raised his hand for silence. Furthermore, our investigation has revealed a pattern of similar incidents involving Officer Dunmore, all covered up by a corrupt command structure that prioritized protecting bad officers over serving justice. At that moment, General Vivian Stanton approached the podium, her red military dress uniform commanding immediate attention. The crowd fell silent as she stepped up to the microphones, her bearing radiating the authority of someone who had spent decades making life and death decisions. Major Calvin Steele is one of our nation's most decorated soldiers, General Stanton began, her voice carrying across the courthouse steps. He has served 3 combat tours, saved countless lives, and dedicated his career to protecting American freedoms. The fact that he was gunned down by the very people sworn to protect and serve is not just a crime against one man, but an attack on everything our military fights to defend. She paused, her eyes scanning the crowd of cameras and reporters. The Pentagon takes attacks on our service members very seriously. regardless of whether they occur overseas or in a gas station parking lot in Millbrook. We will pursue justice with the full weight of federal authority, and we will ensure that the corruption that enabled this attack is completely rooted out. While press conferences dominated the morning news, Chief Walter Simmons sat in his office, frantically shredding documents and deleting files from his computer. His hands shook as he worked, sweat beading on his forehead, despite the air conditioning. 23 years of careful corruption was unraveling faster than he could destroy the evidence. His secretary burst through the door without knocking. "Chief, there are federal agents in the building. They're arresting officers and seizing files." Walter's blood ran cold. He grabbed his car keys and headed for the parking garage. But even as he drove toward the airport, he knew it was too late. His phone buzzed with messages from other corrupt officers, all asking the same panicked questions. The entire house of cards was collapsing. At Millbrook Regional Airport, Walter purchased a one-way ticket to Mexico with cash, his hands trembling as he handed over the bills. He made it through security and was walking toward his gate when he saw her. Lieutenant Diane Holloway, wearing her orange tactical shirt and blue jacket, stood calmly near the boarding area, flanked by 2 federal agents. "Chief Simmons," she called out, her voice echoing through the terminal. "Going somewhere?" Walter's shoulders sagged in defeat as handcuffs clicked around his wrists. "You don't understand the pressure I was under. The union, the mayor, the old boys network. I was trying to protect the department. You were protecting criminals," Lieutenant Holloway replied coldly. "And now you'll answer for every cover-up, every suppressed complaint, and every victim you silenced." News of the arrests spread through Millbrook like wildfire. At the hospital, groups of supporters began gathering in the parking lot, holding signs that read, "Justice for Major Steele," and "Thank you, Pentagon." The community that had lived in fear of police retaliation for so long was finally seeing accountability. Inside the intensive care unit, Rachel Steele sat beside her husband's bed, wearing a red dress that had become wrinkled from days of hospital visits. Major Calvin Steele's condition had stabilized overnight, and for the first time since the shooting, his vital signs showed genuine improvement. Dr. Irene Ashford, her red scrubs fresh from another successful surgery, entered with a smile that had been absent for days. "Mrs. Steele, I have good news. Your husband's brain activity has increased significantly. His body is responding well to the treatments, and we're cautiously optimistic about reducing sedation tomorrow." Rachel's eyes filled with tears of relief. "Does this mean he'll be okay?" "It means he's fighting, and he's winning," Dr. Ashford replied. "Your husband is one of the strongest patients I've ever treated." Colonel Edmund Graves entered the room, his blue jacket bearing the insignia of his rank. His usual stern expression had softened with genuine concern and growing hope. "Rachel, I wanted you to know that Patrick Dunmore and Chief Simmons are both in federal custody. The entire corrupt network is being dismantled." Rachel nodded, squeezing her husband's hand. "Calvin always said that justice might be slow, but it's inevitable when good people refuse to give up." As if responding to her voice, Major Calvin Steele's fingers twitched slightly. Both Rachel and Colonel Graves leaned forward, watching as his eyes began to flutter. Dr. Ashford quickly checked his monitors, her professional excitement barely contained. "He's showing signs of emerging from the coma," she announced. "This is exactly what we've been hoping for." Outside the hospital, news crews captured footage of community members embracing, crying tears of relief, and sharing stories of their own encounters with Patrick Dunmore. For the first time in years, Millbrook's residents felt safe speaking publicly about police misconduct, knowing that federal oversight would protect them from retaliation. Detective Carmen Vega, wearing a red blouse that stood out against the sea of blue uniforms, addressed reporters on the hospital steps. "Today proves that no one is above the law, not even those of us sworn to enforce it. Major Steele's shooting was a tragedy that should never have happened, but his sacrifice has exposed a cancer that was destroying our community's trust in law enforcement." She paused, looking directly into the cameras. "To every resident of Millbrook, I promise that we will rebuild this department with integrity, accountability, and respect for every person we serve." The culture of corruption dies today. As evening approached, General Stanton returned to the hospital, where she found Rachel keeping vigil beside Major Calvin Steele's bed. The general's red uniform seemed to symbolize the strength and determination that had driven the Pentagon's swift response. "Mrs. Steele, your husband's courage under fire, both on the battlefield and in that gas station parking lot, exemplifies everything we expect from our finest soldiers," General Stanton said quietly. "The Pentagon will ensure that his sacrifice leads to meaningful change, not just here in Millbrook, but across the country." Rachel looked up from her husband's bedside, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "Calvin always said that serving your country means standing up for what's right. Even when it's dangerous, even unconscious, he's still serving." As if summoned by her words, Major Calvin Steele's eyes opened slowly, focusing first on Rachel's face, then moving to recognize Colonel Graves and General Stanton. His voice was barely a whisper, but his words carried the strength that had made him a decorated soldier. "Did we get them?" Rachel's tears flowed freely as she kissed his forehead. "Yes, my love. We got them all." The chapter closed with Major Calvin Steele squeezing his wife's hand, his eyes clear and determined despite his injuries. Outside, Millbrook began the long process of healing, knowing that justice had finally arrived with the full weight of federal authority behind it. The corrupt system that had protected Patrick Dunmore was destroyed, and in its place, accountability and hope were taking root. The community that had suffered in silence for so long could finally speak their truth, knowing that this time someone was listening. This time, justice would not be denied. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the federal courthouse in downtown Millbrook, casting sharp geometric patterns across the polished marble floors. Attorney Gerald Okafor adjusted his green suit jacket and straightened his blue tie as he reviewed his final notes one last time. Today would mark the culmination of months of meticulous preparation, the day when justice would finally confront the brutal reality of what Officer Patrick Dunmore had done to Major Calvin Steele. The courtroom filled rapidly with an unusual mix of spectators. Military personnel sat in crisp uniforms alongside community members who had followed every development of the case. General Vivian Stanton, resplendent in her red dress uniform, occupied the front row with Colonel Edmund Graves and Lieutenant Diane Holloway, who wore her signature orange tactical shirt beneath a blue jacket. The weight of federal authority was unmistakable in their presence. Officer Patrick Dunmore entered through a side door, his hands shackled, his once confident demeanor replaced by the hollow stare of a man who had finally grasped the magnitude of his situation. His defense attorney, a harried-looking man named Thompson, carried a briefcase that seemed pitifully inadequate against the mountain of evidence the prosecution had assembled. Judge Margaret Hollister, a stern woman with silver hair and penetrating eyes, called the court to order. The gravity in her voice left no doubt that she understood the national significance of this trial. Attorney Gerald Okafor rose to deliver his opening statement, his voice carrying the authority of both legal expertise and moral conviction. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "this case is about a decorated war hero who served his country with honor for 15 years, only to be shot down like an animal during a routine traffic stop. Major Calvin Steele committed no crime that day. His only offense was driving while black in Officer Patrick Dunmore's jurisdiction." The prosecutor's words hung in the air like an indictment of the entire system that had allowed such an incident to occur. He methodically laid out the timeline of events, from the moment Officer Patrick Dunmore initiated the traffic stop to the federal investigation that exposed decades of corruption within the Millbrook Police Department. When Thompson rose for the defense's opening statement, his arguments sounded weak and desperate. He attempted to portray Officer Patrick Dunmore as a dedicated officer who had made a split-second decision under pressure, but his words carried no conviction. The first witness, "I saw everything," she said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. Major Steele never moved his hands from the steering wheel. He was trying to comply with every instruction, but Officer Dunmore kept escalating the situation. Then he just started shooting. There was no reason for it. The prosecution presented the gas station security footage on large monitors throughout the courtroom. The video showed Major Calvin Steele sitting calmly in his rental car, his hands visible on the steering wheel throughout the encounter. Officer Patrick Dunmore's aggressive posture and erratic movements painted a clear picture of an officer creating a dangerous situation rather than responding to one. When the dashboard camera audio was played, Officer Patrick Dunmore's racial slurs echoed through the silent courtroom. Several jury members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their faces showing disgust at the naked hatred in the former officer's voice. Thompson objected repeatedly, but the evidence was properly authenticated and devastating to his client's case. Dr. Irene Ashford took the stand wearing red medical scrubs, having come directly from her shift at Millbrook General Hospital. Her testimony about Major Calvin Steele's injuries was clinical yet emotionally powerful. She described the massive internal bleeding, the damaged organs, and the multiple surgeries required to save his life. The bullet caused catastrophic damage, she explained, her professional composure barely containing her anger. Major Steele flatlined twice during surgery. We almost lost him because of the severity of his injuries. The trauma he endured was life-threatening and completely unnecessary. The most anticipated moment came when the courtroom was prepared for Major Calvin Steele's testimony via video link from his hospital room. Technical staff adjusted cameras and monitors while the entire courtroom fell silent in anticipation. When the connection was established, Major Calvin Steele appeared on screen, sitting up in his hospital bed, wearing a green polo shirt over medical bandages. Despite his obvious physical weakness, Major Calvin Steele's presence commanded immediate respect. His voice was softer than before his injuries, but his words carried the weight of absolute truth. He recounted the traffic stop with military precision, describing each moment with clarity that highlighted Officer Patrick Dunmore's aggressive escalation. "I followed every instruction given to me," Major Calvin Steele testified, his eyes never leaving the camera. "I kept my hands visible at all times. I announced my movements before making them. I did everything I was trained to do to de-escalate the situation." Officer Dunmore seemed determined to create a confrontation regardless of my compliance. When asked about his military service, Major Calvin Steele's quiet dignity shone through despite his physical condition. He spoke about his deployments, his commitment to protecting American freedoms, and his belief in justice under law. The contrast between his composed testimony and Officer Patrick Dunmore's increasingly agitated demeanor was stark. Thompson's cross-examination was a disaster. Every question he asked only served to highlight Major Calvin Steele's exemplary character and Officer Patrick Dunmore's complete lack of justification for his actions. When Thompson suggested that Major Calvin Steele might have appeared threatening, the decorated soldier's response was devastating. "I was sitting in my car with my hands on the steering wheel, sir. If that appears threatening to a police officer, then perhaps the problem lies not with the citizen, but with the officer's training and mindset." Detective Carmen Vega's testimony provided crucial insight into the culture of corruption that had protected Officer Patrick Dunmore for years. Wearing a red blouse and black blazer, she detailed the systematic cover-ups, the destroyed evidence, and the intimidation tactics used against honest officers who tried to report misconduct. "I watched good cops leave the department because they couldn't stomach the corruption," she testified. Officer Dunmore knew he was protected, no matter what he did. That protection enabled him to become increasingly violent and reckless. As witness after witness testified, the prosecution built an unassailable case against Officer Patrick Dunmore. Ballistics experts confirmed that Major Calvin Steele could not have reached for any weapon from his position in the car. Audio specialists verified that the racial slurs on the dashboard camera were authentic and had not been tampered with. When Officer Patrick Dunmore finally took the stand in his own defense, his testimony was a catastrophe of contradictions and barely contained hostility. He attempted to portray himself as a victim of federal overreach, but his answers only reinforced the evidence of his guilt. His claim that he feared for his life rang hollow when confronted with video evidence showing Major Calvin Steele's complete compliance. Attorney Gerald Okafor's cross-examination was surgical in its precision. He methodically destroyed every aspect of Officer Patrick Dunmore's defense, highlighting the inconsistencies in his testimony and the mountain of evidence contradicting his claims. "You shot an unarmed man who was complying with your orders," Okafor stated. "You then lied about it in your official report, claiming he reached for a weapon that didn't exist. Is that correct?" Officer Patrick Dunmore's stuttered denials only made his guilt more apparent. His attempts to justify his actions became increasingly desperate as the prosecutor exposed each lie and contradiction. The closing arguments crystallized the moral stakes of the trial. Attorney Gerald Okafor spoke passionately about justice, accountability, and the need to protect citizens from those who abuse their authority. Thompson's closing argument was perfunctory, a man going through the motions of a defense he knew was hopeless. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood with the gravity of someone delivering historical judgment. The guilty verdicts on all charges echoed through the packed courtroom. Attempted murder, civil rights violations, filing false reports, and conspiracy. Officer Patrick Dunmore's face went ashen as each verdict was read. The reality of spending decades in federal prison finally penetrated his delusions of protection and privilege. Several spectators openly wept with relief and vindication. In a separate proceeding that afternoon, Chief Walter Simmons appeared before the same judge to formally plead guilty to federal corruption charges. Wearing an orange jumpsuit instead of his former blue police jacket, he cut a pathetic figure as he admitted to years of covering up misconduct and accepting bribes. General Vivian Stanton held a press conference on the courthouse steps as the sun began to set over Millbrook. Her red uniform caught the golden light as she announced the permanent federal oversight of the Millbrook Police Department. "Today justice was served," she declared. "But our work is far from over. The systematic failures that enabled Officer Dunmore's crimes must be completely eliminated. The Millbrook Police Department will be rebuilt from the ground up with accountability and community trust as its foundation." As the crowds dispersed and the media packed their equipment, the courthouse stood as a symbol of justice finally delivered. The reckoning was complete, but the work of healing and transformation was just beginning. Major Calvin Steele's courage in surviving and testifying had exposed a corrupt system and paved the way for meaningful change. The trial's conclusion marked more than just individual accountability. It represented a fundamental shift in how law enforcement would operate in Millbrook, with federal oversight ensuring that the failures that nearly cost Major Calvin Steele his life would never be repeated. Justice had spoken with clear, uncompromising voice, and the echoes of that reckoning would reshape an entire community's relationship with those sworn to protect and serve. 6 months had passed since that fateful day at the Sunoco station, and the morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the Pentagon's ceremonial hall, casting golden light across the polished floors where hundreds of military personnel stood at attention. The overhead fluorescent lights combined with the natural skylight created perfect visibility as Major Calvin Steele, resplendent in his green dress uniform with crisp black pants, walked slowly but steadily toward the podium where General Vivian Stanton waited in her red ceremonial dress uniform. Each step Calvin took represented a victory over the bullets that had nearly claimed his life. The months of grueling physical therapy, the sleepless nights wrestling with trauma, the gradual rebuilding of strength and purpose had all led to this moment. His bearing was as proud and dignified as ever, though those who knew him well could see the subtle changes that surviving such an ordeal had etched into his character. Rachel Steele sat in the front row, wearing a beautiful red dress that seemed to glow under the bright lights. Tears of pride and relief glistened in her eyes as she watched her husband receive recognition, not just for his years of distinguished service, but for his unwitting role in exposing a system of corruption that had poisoned an entire community. Beside her, Colonel Edmund Graves stood at attention in his green military jacket and black pants, his weathered face reflecting deep respect for the man who had endured so much. The ceremony itself was both solemn and celebratory. General Stanton's voice carried clearly through the hall as she recounted Calvin's service record, his dedication to his country, and the courage he had shown not just in overseas operations, but in the way he had conducted himself during those terrifying moments at the gas station and throughout the long months of recovery that followed. Today, we honor Major Calvin Steele not only for his exceptional service to our nation in classified operations that we cannot fully detail here, but for his grace under the most trying circumstances any soldier should have to face on American soil, General Stanton announced. her red uniform commanding attention as she held the Purple Heart Medal. This decoration is typically awarded for wounds received in combat against enemy forces. Today, we expand that definition to honor wounds received while serving justice and truth in the face of institutional corruption. As the medal was pinned to Calvin's chest, the silence in the room was profound. Every person present understood they were witnessing something historic, a moment that acknowledged not just individual heroism, but the complex realities of service and sacrifice in modern America. Lieutenant Diane Holloway, standing with other Pentagon officials in her orange shirt and blue military jacket, felt a deep satisfaction knowing that their investigation had not only brought justice for Calvin, but had exposed a network of corruption that stretched back decades. The meticulous work of building cases against Officer Patrick Dunmore and Chief Walter Simmons had consumed months of her life, but seeing Calvin stand strong and whole made every long night and difficult interview worthwhile. Meanwhile, nearly 200 miles away in Millbrook, Officer Patrick Dunmore was beginning another day of his 25-year federal sentence. The harsh reality of prison life had stripped away all pretense of authority and superiority. The man who had once worn his badge like a shield for his prejudices now spent his days in an orange jumpsuit, confronting the consequences of choices that had destroyed multiple lives, including his own. The federal penitentiaries' overhead fluorescent lights provided unforgiving illumination as Dunmore sat in his cell, no longer able to hide behind false narratives or departmental protection. The guilty verdicts on attempted murder, civil rights violations, and conspiracy charges had sealed his fate, but more than that, they had sealed his legacy as a symbol of everything wrong with unchecked police power. Back in Millbrook itself, Detective Carmen Vega was settling into her new role as interim chief of the completely restructured police department. Wearing her red blouse and black pants as she walked through the renovated station house, she represented the new face of law enforcement in the community. The federal oversight that General Stanton had implemented meant that every policy, every hiring decision, every training protocol was designed to prevent the kind of systematic abuse that had flourished under the old regime. The transformation was remarkable. Where once the department had operated like a closed fraternity protecting its worst members, the new structure emphasized transparency, community engagement, and rigorous accountability. Officers now wore body cameras that could not be disabled, participated in regular bias training, and faced immediate suspension for any credible complaint, while independent investigations were conducted. Carmen often found herself thinking about the courage it had taken for Major Steele to remain calm and compliant during those terrifying moments with Dunmore, even as he must have recognized the danger he faced. That kind of grace under pressure had become the standard she hoped to instill in every officer under her command. The community response to these changes had been cautiously optimistic at first, but was growing stronger as residents saw real evidence of reform. Town meetings that had once been contentious affairs, marked by distrust and anger, were becoming genuine forums for collaboration between law enforcement and the people they served. Dr. Irene Ashford, still working her shifts in red scrubs under the hospital's bright overhead lights, had followed Calvin's recovery with professional interest and personal investment. The night she had fought to save his life remained one of the most challenging of her career, not because of the medical complexity, but because of the moral weight of treating someone who had been shot simply for existing while black in America. His recovery had been slower than anyone hoped, but faster than some had dared expect. The internal injuries had healed well, but the psychological trauma had required careful attention from specialists who understood both military PTSD and the unique challenges faced by civilians who survived police violence. Attorney Gerald Okafor, wearing his signature green suit with blue tie, had just finished reviewing the final settlements in the civil cases that had emerged from the federal investigation. The monetary compensation could never truly address the harm done to Calvin and the other victims they had discovered, but it represented official acknowledgement of institutional failure and commitment to preventing future incidents. More importantly, the legal precedents established through these cases would make it easier for other victims of police corruption to seek justice. Federal courts had affirmed that departments could be held liable not just for individual officer misconduct, but for creating cultures that enabled such misconduct to flourish. As afternoon approached, Calvin found himself back in Millbrook for the first time since that terrible day 6 months ago. The community had organized a healing ceremony, and he had agreed to speak despite his natural preference for privacy. The event was being held in the same area where protests had erupted after his shooting, but the atmosphere now was entirely different. Families gathered under the bright afternoon sun, children playing nearby, while adults listened to speakers who emphasized hope, progress, and the ongoing work of building a better community. Calvin stood at the microphone, looking out at faces that included both longtime residents and newer arrivals who had moved to Millbrook specifically because of the reforms that had been implemented. 6 months ago, I was just passing through your town, Calvin began, his voice steady and clear. I never expected to become part of your community's story, and certainly not in the way that happened. But sometimes our paths cross with history in ways we never could have anticipated. The crowd listened intently as he continued. I want to be clear about something. What happened to me was not unique. It was part of a pattern that had been harming people in this community for years. The difference was that my situation brought resources and attention that finally made change possible. He paused, looking toward Carmen Vega, who stood with other officers in their new community policing uniforms, bright orange shirts and blue pants that were designed to be more approachable than traditional police attire. Real change doesn't happen because of one incident or one lawsuit, Calvin continued. It happens because people like Chief Vega and her officers wake up every day, committed to doing better than the day before. It happens because citizens stay engaged with their local government instead of assuming someone else will handle the problems. Rachel stood near the back of the crowd, watching her husband with a mixture of pride and lingering concern. The physical scars had healed, but she knew he still struggled with nightmares and moments of anxiety that he tried to hide from others. Their marriage had been tested by the trauma and the months of uncertainty, but they had emerged stronger and more connected than ever. Colonel Graves, in his green shirt and blue jacket, observed Calvin's address with the eye of someone who had seen many soldiers face various forms of combat. What impressed him most was Calvin's ability to channel his experience into something constructive rather than allowing it to breed bitterness or cynicism. As the ceremony concluded, Calvin made his way through the crowd, shaking hands and accepting embraces from people who had become stakeholders in his story. An elderly man in a blue jacket approached him, introducing himself as someone who had witnessed the original shooting and had provided testimony that helped convict Dunmore. I've been living in this town for 40 years, the man said, his voice thick with emotion. I've seen too many good people hurt by bad cops. Thank you for helping us finally clean house. Calvin clasped the man's hand firmly. Thank you for speaking up when it mattered. That took real courage. Similar conversations continued for nearly an hour as Calvin connected with community members who had played various roles in exposing the corruption and demanding change. Each interaction reinforced his growing sense that his ordeal had contributed to something larger and more meaningful than personal justice. As evening approached, Calvin prepared to return to his Delta Force unit the following morning. The doctors had cleared him for full duty, though he would continue with regular psychological counseling as part of his ongoing recovery process. His teammates had maintained contact throughout his recuperation, and he was eager to rejoin the mission work that gave his life purpose and meaning. Lieutenant Holloway approached him as the community event wound down, wearing her orange blouse and blue jacket in the fading afternoon light. Major Steele, I wanted you to know that the Pentagon has implemented new protocols based on what we learned from your case, she said. Anytime active military personnel are involved in civilian law enforcement incidents, we now have automatic notification systems and rapid response procedures. Calvin nodded thoughtfully. That's good to hear. Maybe it will help someone else avoid what I went through. The ripple effects are still spreading, Holloway continued. We've had requests from police departments in 6 other states asking for consultation on implementing similar reform programs to what we've established here in Millbrook. Standing there in the evening light, Calvin reflected on the strange journey that had brought him to this point. 6 months ago, he had been a soldier, focused primarily on overseas missions and national security threats. Now he found himself inadvertently playing a role in domestic conversations about justice accountability, and the possibility of systemic change. The transformation of Millbrook's police department was already being studied by criminal justice researchers and cited by reform advocates as proof that meaningful change was possible, even in deeply corrupted institutions. But Calvin knew that lasting change would require sustained commitment from the community long after the media attention faded and the federal oversight eventually ended. As he prepared to leave Millbrook, Calvin felt a complex mixture of emotions: relief at putting this chapter behind him, satisfaction at knowing his experience had contributed to positive change, and determination to continue serving his country while remaining engaged with the ongoing work of building a more just society. The story that had begun with hatred and violence was ending with healing and hope, though Calvin understood that endings in real life are rarely as clean as they appear in retrospect. The work of maintaining the changes that had been implemented would continue long after he returned to his military duties. You just heard a story that history tried to overlook. If it stayed with you, take a second to stand with it. Subscribe, share, and help us keep telling the stories that deserve light, not silence.